Hello, you're watching Scotland at 7. It's the 4th of March, and in the studio, myself, Hugh, Stewart, and Brian Liddy, and we're going to discuss the main stories tonight, but beginning with day 9, Brian, of the Russian attack on Ukraine. Here are the main points. Russian troops have seized Europe's largest nuclear plant, Zaporizhzhia, after a fire sparked by heavy shelling. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Mario Grossi, offered to travel to Ukraine to facilitate talks with Russia aimed at guaranteeing the safety of nuclear plants during the conflict. The situation continues to be extremely tense and challenging, he said. But more of that in a couple of minutes. Secondly, NATO General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg has warned the days to come are likely to be worse, calling Russia's invasion of Ukraine the worst military aggression in Europe for decades. But he stressed NATO was a defensive alliance and is not seeking a war with Russia. Mr. Stoltenberg said foreign ministers discussed a no-fly zone over Ukraine, but agreed that NATO planes should not operate over Ukrainian airspace. He also said NATO has evidence that Russia was using cluster bombs. The UN Security Council will hold an emergency meeting later today following Russia's attack on a Zaporizhzhia plant. More than 1.2 million people have fled Ukraine into neighbouring countries since Russia launched its full-scale invasion on the 24th of February, the UN said, including about 500,000 children. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky appealed directly to Russians to stage protests over the seizure of the nuclear power infrastructure by Russian troops. Russian people, I want to appeal to you. How is this possible, he said. After all, we fought together in 1986 against the Chernobyl catastrophe. US President Joe Biden and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also condemned Russia for shelling the plant and starting the blaze, which took hold in a training building on the site's perimeter. Russia's defence ministry blamed the attack on the nuclear plant on Ukrainian saboteurs, calling it a monstrous provocation. Now let's just stop for a minute, Brian, before we look at the rest of the main news today. So this nuclear plant is obviously an extremely sensitive site. Now, just how dangerous would this plant have been had the staff not been able to attend and deal with things in time?
Thanks. Reports on the that I've heard said that, well, for a start, this nuclear power plant is the biggest in Europe. So that gives you an idea about perhaps the scale of the facility. And we're told that if there had been any leakage there, then it could have been anything up to 4 times bigger than Chernobyl. So really quite a sizable...
Okay, so that's the scale of the problem there, of the reckless behaviour by Russia here could have caused a nuclear catastrophe that would have affected half of Europe. So fortunately the staff are on site and keeping the cooling functioning. Next point today, Vladimir Putin warned Russia's neighbours not to escalate the situation by imposing more risk. That Russia had already conveyed to the Ukrainian side our vision of solving this problem. Ukraine and Russia agreed to try to create humanitarian corridors to evacuate civilians in a second round of talks on Thursday. A third round is set to take place next week. Ukraine's culture minister called for the skies to be closed over Ukraine because Russian forces are destroying cultural sites. Alexander Shashenko said most of Putin's war crimes had been committed from the air and were deliberately destroying the historic centres of big cities. The United Nations Human Rights Council overwhelmingly voted to create a top-level investigation into violations committed following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with 32 members of the 47-seat council in favour, only Russia and Eritrea voting against. The death toll from Russian airstrikes in a residential district of the city of Chernihiv rose to 47, regional authorities said. Rescue work had to be suspended due to heavy shelling, according to local emergency services. Russia's parliament passed a law imposing a jail term of up to 15 years for spreading intentionally fake information about the armed forces. And finally, Russia admitted to limiting access to news websites, including the BBC, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the independent Russian site Meduza, along with Germany's Deutsche Welle. with Facebook also blocked. So that's the latest we have today. So, Brian, as well as that threat to the nuclear plant, which seems to be under control now, we also hear a lot of talk on information and disinformation there. So at the end, all these radio stations have been blocked. Local Moscow Echo radio station was taken off the air yesterday, or at least it's severely censored. So I think they don't feel they can continue. And at the same time, Russia is saying that the attack on the nuclear power plant was caused by Ukrainians. So there's an info war going on there too, isn't there?
Yeah, and it seems that back at home in Russia, the Russian government or Putin seems to be winning that war. You mentioned radio stations. One of the things that you mentioned was that the BBC was going to suspend news in Russia. Is that right? Did you mention that one?
Yes, that's on the end of that.
To avoid going to jail. That's a direct result of the Duma, the parliament in Russia, bringing in a new law recently which made it illegal to do what they said was to spread false information about the Russian army. And if you were found guilty of doing that, then there was a 15-year jail sentence attached to that. So obviously the BBC, who do have staff in Russia, they can't honestly report what's going on in the Ukraine if they're then going to be blamed of spreading falsehoods about the Russian army and then being sent to jail. So they've been recalled. But in response to that, the BBC have decided to relaunch their shortwave radio service, which is apparently because it's it's not digital. It's less likely to be stopped if there's if there's a communications blackout. It's a bit more robust. And also it's maybe worth mentioning that the BBC's Ukrainian service on the World Service is, and Russian-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking sections of the World Service their figures have gone through the roof of people that are logging on to there to try and find out what's happening in Russia. But there's even stories of people in the Ukraine who have family or relatives back in Russia trying to tell what's really happening and what's really going on, and that this is an invasion by Russia and that the Ukrainians are peaceful, really, essentially, and their relatives and their friends back in Russia refuse to believe them. They're believing the Russian line. So I don't really know. This is what we're up against. I don't know.
Yeah, it's maybe oversimplifying it a bit, but it seems to me that young people who are in the habit of looking at social media are probably better informed than the grannies who still have faith in Russian news broadcasting. And of course that explains the line that we're fighting Nazis, right? Because obviously there's that memory of when Russia did actually fight the genuine Nazis, so they're playing on that. But
yeah, and if you go online, then I'm sure you'll have seen I think it's maybe even the next story about where there are videos of Russian soldiers that have been captured and they've been interviewed.
yes, we'll look
That's
at that
coming
in a
up.
couple of minutes. We'll discuss it anyway.
Yeah, so.
Okay, so as you say, Brian, the BBC and other media in Russia are finding it very difficult to work just now. I'm assuming the idea is that BBC has Russian citizens working for them there, so they would be under threat.
Yes.
I presume UK citizens would probably just be asked to leave. But
Yeah.
Russians who broadcast what the Russian government regards as false information could face 15 years in jail.
Yeah, and you also mentioned the possibility of a no-fly zone that's been raised by NATO, but apparently that's a no-fly zone is a lot more complicated than you might expect. It sounds like a good thing, it sounds like common sense, but apparently if you were to put a no-fly zone in place, then it would hamper the Ukrainian planes and flights as much as any Russian or ally flights. And then there's also the risk that even if Ukrainian planes were allowed to fly, there's a possibility, it sounds a bit like a conspiracy theory, but Russian planes could disguise themselves as either a Ukrainian or an ally plane and be able to evade a no-fly zone. But it seems basically that a real no-fly zone means no flights for any side, and then that means that supplies, munitions and support from Ukraine's allies would have just as much trouble getting through as stopping the Russians going in and causing bombings.
Yes, we will hear more of this, I'm sure, because it has been a point that's been raised by Ukrainians. Why is the West not imposing a no-fly zone? And that's presumably because of the air war, which we heard about. We also heard today that the Russians have failed to capture a major airport around, I think it's quite near Kyiv. They're still fighting on the ground for that one. So the Russians haven't won the air war. I also read today that most of Ukraine's air force is still intact. So the Russians presumably they want to establish their superiority, but they also don't want to knock out the airports and runways because they would plan to use them themselves. But that's obviously an issue that's it's not going to go away. Just how much does NATO want to get involved? And it's significant that Jens Stoltenberg said in that report, remember, we are a defensive alliance. So NATO doesn't want to take that step of turning from defence to attack.
Aggression, yeah. And just one very quick point, you also mentioned cluster bombs. The implication is that well, it seems clear that Russia is using cluster bombs. There are lots of photographs on social media of items that have been found unexploded and they've been identified as cluster bombs. But and apparently they're illegal, but only if you signed up to the treaty that says so. Apparently Russia hasn't signed up to that treaty, so they're therefore they would consider themselves allowed to use cluster bombs.
Yes, I see. So this raises the question of to what extent can Putin and generals be potentially accused of being war criminals? So again, that's one of the things that the International Court is actually looking at, and they have underlined it's going to be very difficult to assemble evidence. But certainly Ian Blackford already in the Parliament the other day said, "Oh, we can say right now that Putin is a war criminal." So let's just go a bit more detail into the story of the nuclear plant at Zaporizhzhia. The plant has been seized by Russian military forces, and this is the nuclear plant which, as Brian said a minute ago, is many times bigger than the Chernobyl plant. I think it's the biggest in Europe, did you say, Brian?
It's the biggest in Europe, yeah.
So the plant was seized by Russian military forces, according to the regional authorities, after a fire sparked by overnight shelling, which burned for several hours at this large facility. Petro Kotin, the acting president of the state-run nuclear power corporation, Energatom, said workers had been allowed by the Russian forces to go back to their posts at the nuclear plant, but had been working under the barrels of machine guns, and they were physically and mentally exhausted. Ukraine's State Inspectorate for Nuclear Regulation said in a statement on its Facebook page the plant had been captured by the military forces of the Russian Federation. Changes in the radiation state for the current time have not been recorded, he said. The statement said, adding that power units 2 and 3 had been disconnected from the network and nuclear installations were being cooled down, but it warned that any loss of the possibility to cool down nuclear fuel will lead to significant radioactive releases into the environment, which could exceed all previous accidents at nuclear power plants, including Chernobyl or the accident at Fukushima Daiichi in Japan. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, said it had been informed that a projectile overnight had hit a training building in the vicinity of one of the plant's reactor units, causing a localised fire which was later extinguished. Mr. Kotin said Russian forces had broken through a Ukrainian barricade on Thursday night with 100 armed vehicles and had begun shelling the plant. He said they had targeted administrative buildings and the checkpoint at the entrance until they won control of the site. Yeah, now what do you think would be the military objectives of attacking and possibly destroying a nuclear plant with appalling consequences? What do you think was the objective there?
I would assume that the basic objective would be to gain control of the power supply. So literally civilians in Ukraine, they'd be relying on power stations, including this nuclear power station, for electricity and for heating and lighting. So it's militarily, it's something that you would definitely want to control if you were an invading force. The thing that's incredible to try and comprehend is that you would try and secure it. I would imagine without actually shelling a nuclear power station. It seems like common sense that you don't bomb a nuclear power station if you don't want to cause some kind of nuclear incident. So I would say that was the basic.
But it's not the first time that we've seen an atrocity from the Russians, and Russian state media blames the other side for it. It's also happened. I've seen pictures before Russian RT was taken off YouTube. I saw pictures of apartment blocks which had been bombed by the Russians, and they put it into a story. But it's the same apartment block I'd just been watching on Euronews, and they say this has been attacked by the Ukrainians.
Yeah, and if you think about how Russian fake news could spin this, it would come across as quite chilling to people back at home in Russia. But if they'd been told that the bombing was caused by the Ukrainians and that the Ukrainians were willing to cause a nuclear incident, then how bad would that make them look? It's just, again, it would imply that the Ukrainian forces have complete disregard for the safety of their own people in their own country. So it plays right into the propaganda hand of the Russian state. And it's maybe worth, you gave me a piece of paper earlier on which says that, to give you an idea about the scale, this is from the Ukrainian government, a press release which said, if at any point the cooling process was disturbed, this could cause radioactive damage across large territories and would have irreparable consequences for Europe's environment. They go on to say that there is a storage facility for spent nuclear fuel on the site, but any damage to the facility would also lead to nuclear radiation release. And then they went on to say that if there had been a nuclear disaster, the scale could have exceeded all previous accidents at nuclear power plants, including Chernobyl and Fukushima. So, yeah, that just shows you how dangerous the situation was.
Yes, in the West, I think Chernobyl really is used as another way of saying we don't want nuclear power, isn't it? Because of that massive disaster. And significantly, of course, the Chernobyl reactor, which went out of control and wasn't cooled, was during the old Soviet era. So I think the reason is apart from the obvious health and safety reasons, but the emphasis that the Ukrainian government is giving through that press statement is saying, well, this isn't Soviet, this is Ukraine. We've been looking after this plant, and we were looking after it okay until you started bombing it. Right? So, as again, many world leaders have said, attacking this nuclear plant, bigger than Chernobyl, is just the most foolish and reckless thing you could do. Lots of people have been condemning that act. And of course the Russians can't justify it, so they try and say it wasn't us, it was the other side.
It seems like common sense, and again, you wonder about who actually gave the order to shell it, and what were they thinking? Did they even realise that it was a nuclear power plant? Did they think it was maybe just an ordinary electrical power station? I've no idea, but it just seems incredible that.
So when people still talk about Chernobyl, we could have been talking about Zaporizhia, but hopefully the technicians working under gunpoint seem to have it under control. So yeah, let's move on now. The next story, also in Ukraine, talks about demoralised Russian soldiers. Now, Brian, we don't have exact witnesses. We're taking this from a number of sources, though, and we've 2 or 3 sources which add up to the same story, which is that there's a growing number of videos of captured Russian soldiers being interrogated by the Ukrainian military, in which the Russian soldiers say they were unaware that they were being sent to invade Ukraine but thought they were on exercises. When asked what message he would like to send to his soldiers and Russians back home, an officer replied that his military superiors sitting in Moscow tricked them. Everything we were told was fake. I would tell my guys to leave Ukrainian territory. We've got families and children. I think 90% of us would agree to go home, said the officer. There are numerous similar interviews with Russian captives which have been circulating on Ukrainian social media channels expressing similar sentiments. Several videos show young men calling their mothers back in Russia who had no idea their sons were fighting in Ukraine. The mothers typically broke down. The Ukrainian authorities have opened a hotline for worried Russian relatives. That's Ukrainian authorities reaching out to Russian families. Others have abandoned their vehicles and have set off on foot towards the Russian border, lugging their weapons and kit bags, videos suggest. These episodes do not mean that the Kremlin will fail in its attempts to conquer Ukraine, as its tactics will shift to the brutal shelling of civilians, but low morale among the invading troops might be one reason why Russia's blitzkrieg plan to overwhelm Ukraine appears not to have progressed at the speed Putin would have wanted. The assumption in Moscow was that the operation would be swift and successful. Soldiers were given food and fuel supplies for only 2 or 3 days, the videos suggest. The Kremlin also appears to have had a totally fantastical idea of the reception they would get. Several prisoners of war said they had been assured that the Ukrainians would welcome them as liberators. Russian forces were expecting flowers and cheers, not bullets and bombs, they said. Ukraine claims to have killed several thousand Russian troops. This figure may be an exaggeration. However, on Wednesday, the Kremlin admitted to 498 of its servicemen who had died, with 1,591 wounded. There's a real sense that many Russian servicemen regret ever having come to Ukraine. Our journey has ended for some in death or disillusionment. So I've said, Ryan, like you, I've looked at several reports on social media of captured Russian Russian soldiers really saying the same story. Now, we have to be careful, of course. These don't come from the sort of sources we like. We usually like to get journalists on the spot, or Reuters and so forth. But there's such a lot of this. Well, do you get... I think you get the impression, yeah, there is a genuine feeling here that the Russians, who are 80% conscripts, I believe, is that right?
Yes, so
Russians,
believe,
they've been
yes.
told, it's just exercises, and they suddenly find out they're in enemy territory.
Yeah, and if you do take time to seek out these videos of these interviews of these captured Russian soldiers, they're really quite... some of them are difficult to watch, but they're just kind of heartrending in a sense. It's like these are just lads, you know. You can tell that they're teenagers still. You're right. We have to be careful when we consider using them, because the source is unverified. As you say, it's not coming from Reuters or a well-known journalist from the BBC that we can trust. There's been no fact checks have been done, but at the same time, they look more than plausible. These lads, these young men, they don't look as if they've been tortured in any way. They might have a few grazes, just from maybe the battlefield and when being captured, but they're not shackled or tied in any way. Some of them are even lying in hospital beds, and the like. And they're being quite gently interviewed by someone off camera who says, "So who are you, and why? How did you get here? And are you Russian or are you Ukrainian?" And the facial expressions on these young men is you know, it's really quite something to behold. And then quite often there comes a point in the interview when they're asked, "So what would you say to the people back home, to your friends and relatives back home?" And there's lots of big heavy sighs and shoulders are dropped, and you know, and you can just tell that they realise that they've been lied to, that they shouldn't really be there. They should be somewhere else, not in the Ukraine and in essentially a foreign country, and they seem to acknowledge freely that it's wrong that they were sent there. So hopefully these videos will be verified, you know, by a reputable body. They will be fact checked, but at the moment it's just incredibly sad to watch.
Yes, I feel exactly the same. And I mean, they just look like young lads too. They just look like school kids, some of them, and they've no idea what they're doing there. Now, one thing though I noticed from that story, and I underlined it, is that the Ukrainian government itself has set up a helpline for families in Russia. Now, it's quite normal, of course, for governments to say there's been a disaster. If you want to know how your relatives are, here's a helpline. But I don't know if I've ever heard belligerents in the war offering that helpline to the other side. Is that clever politicking by the Ukrainians?
Yes, it is, I suppose, but it's more than that. I think it's also just humanitarian, and I think that probably is because the Ukrainians, they'll be watching the same videos on social media, and there was one, I tried to find it earlier on but failed. There was one a few days ago where it showed a woman in Russia being approached by a friend and being videoed at the time, and they had pictures of her son who was in the Russian army who had been captured by the Ukrainians, and this friend is saying, "Isn't that your lad? Isn't that your boy?" And the mother's looking at it and going, "Well, yes." And her son's been interviewed as to why he's there as part of the Russian army, and he's saying, "We shouldn't be here," and tell the people back home that it's all a lie. And And the mother then there and there says, "But he told me he wasn't going to Ukraine. He was going somewhere else, and he was only going to be on manoeuvres. What's he doing captured in Ukraine?" And so it's just, and these things, they don't look staged at all. You know, obviously we don't know at this moment, but they really, it looks like real life playing out, and we can't blame those young Russian soldiers. It's not their fault that they're there.
Well, there's conscripts, as I said before. They haven't signed up for this. In fact, they haven't signed up for anything. They've been telt. But just to underline the point on casualties, we don't know, of course, it's impossible to verify, but the Ukrainian government said the other day they believe that almost 6,000 Russian troops have been killed. The Russians are saying it's about 500, but that's the latest we've heard anyway. Okay, so next story, and this is nothing at all to do with Russia. It's about the Conservative Party. Oh, wait a minute, it does have something to do with Russia, Brian. There have been calls for the Conservatives to sack their co-chair Ben Elliott for being at the heart of links between his party and Russian money. Labour leader Keir Starmer called for Mr Elliott to step back from his role or be removed after revelations about his firm's Russian business and the Tories accepting donations from wealthy Russians or companies linked to Russia. Ben Elliott has been chair of the party while it has taken donations from Lyubov Chernyukin, who is the wife of Vladimir Putin's former finance minister, and Aquind, which is a company co-owned by the billionaire Viktor Fedotov. Neither is subject to sanctions, and the Conservatives have previously said that in relation to Chernyukin and Aquind, that all donations were properly and transparently declared, as they put it, in line with electoral law. Chernyukin, who has British citizenship, has condemned the invasion of Ukraine and called Putin's regime despotic. Ben Elliott is also the co-owner of Quintessentially, which is a concierge service for the super wealthy that's counted many Russians among its clients, including, reportedly, Roman Abramovich, the Chelsea owner, who has faced mounting calls for him to face UK sanctions. There's also concerns that the UK is failing to act as quickly as the EU in imposing sanctions on Russian oligarchs. So once again, it's Russian money in the Conservative Party. Now, the standard answer was read out there, that all donations have been done properly and checked, all from UK citizens, etc. But why is that not enough? Aren't you happy with that, Brian? I see you looking cynically at me.
Well, technically it's true. These are Russian oligarchs who have applied to have a visa which allows them to become British citizens, and they are on the electoral register, which means that they can vote in general elections and the like. So essentially, these are British oligarchs that we're talking about. They're no longer Russian oligarchs. So they're good oligarchs. They're on our side, and they're not to be. We don't need to have any need to fear them at all. So that and this company, Quintessentially, that you mentioned, which, as you say, is a luxury concierge company, they cater to the personal needs of the Russian wealthy and have been doing that for 15 years
and
now.
They have expensive needs, don't they?
Very expensive needs, and so they can help you do anything from buy a top-end property in London, which they've done on many occasions, or if you just want to get tickets for the whatever the next big concert is that's got hard to get tickets. It's like they will literally, Quintessentially, will help you get anything you want. If money is no object, they'll get you it. And the reason why they find it easy to get it for you is because they have these connections within the Conservative Party. Not only within the Conservative Party, but it's recently come to light that Mr. Elliott is the nephew of Camilla Parker Bowles, who's married to Prince Charles. Is that?
I think that's right, yes. I don't follow the role.
It's an incredible web that they have woven.
Yep. So are you saying if you give Quintessentially enough money, you could have lunch with Douglas Ross?
Or Ruth Davidson even, or both of them simultaneously at the same time together. So, although I would rather pay not to, but anyway, sorry, I digress. It really just is an incredible state of affairs, and Quintessentially, they had a beautiful website which stated clearly what their aim was. If you're a wealthy Russian, then we can get you whatever you want, anything, whatever you desire. And then when it came to light, it was his close connections to the Conservative Party and to Camilla Parker Bowles. That website, well, people said it had disappeared and it had been taken down, but it hadn't been taken down. It had just been moved to the right a little bit. They changed the photographs and translated it from English into Russian, but it's still there as far as I know and still able to provide. So.
Yep. It's interesting though, I looked at Fedotov, the owner, the joint owner of Aquind. Viktor Fedotov has been a huge donor to the Conservative Party. He's really given very large donations, as has his partner, Alexander Timenko. Now, Timenko also has given lots of money to the Conservative Party, and he is described by The Guardian as a close friend of Boris Johnson. They really are chums. They've been photographed at lots of parties. So these guys put huge amounts of money into the Conservative Party. I mean, we're talking millions really between them and other oligarchs. Literally millions are really funding the Conservative Party. It's
a very rich theme, Hugh, and you can have a lot of fun online looking into the Quintessential's clients, Russian clients. There's one that I found really quickly. There's a chap called Mikhail Lezin. He's a former client of Quintessentially. Not only is he a former client of the company, he was also an advisor, a direct advisor to Putin. Apparently his nickname when he was working for Putin was the bulldozer, because he was able to force media companies to bend to the Kremlin's will. And these are the kind of people that are quintessentially his clients. So, and only 1 or 2 steps away from the royal family.
Right, quintessentially conservative. So in this way of looking after the expensive needs of the rich, is Britain finding its new post-Brexit role in the world, Brian?
It's for the time being. There's maybe I think Britain's driving on fumes. That tank is of Britain's international reputation and how it can trade on it and soft power and the like. I think it's very, very much near the bottom of the tank. So perhaps for a little while longer, but not for much longer. I would hazard a guess.
Okay, that's it. So yeah, if you have a couple of million to spare and you want influence in Britain, then yeah, quintessentially as your concierge. I think
if you've got money to burn.
Okay, now the next story, back to Ukraine. Well, Scottish Government is offering critical aid for people injured in Ukraine. Ventilators, bandages and syringe pumps are being sent to Ukraine as part of the second shipment of medical supplies and equipment donated by NHS Scotland. More than 130,000 items urgently requested by the Ukrainian government will be flown from Stansted Airport onto Poland on Sunday for onward transport to Ukraine. The latest medical aid, valued at about 1.2 million, follows an initial shipment which was sent out earlier this week and is in addition to the £4 million of humanitarian assistance for Ukraine announced by the Scottish Government on Monday, of which the United Nations children's organisation UNICEF will receive £1 million. Together with other United Nations agencies, UNICEF is establishing a series of child-friendly refuges along key travel corridors in countries bordering Ukraine to provide critical support to children and families fleeing the Russian invasion. UNICEF is also working with the Ukrainian government to ensure continuity of child protection services, including plans for the evacuation of children in institutional facilities. Scotland's Europe Minister Neil Gray said, "We have watched in horror and anger as Russia's illegal war of aggression has led to deplorable loss of lives, livelihoods and of homes. Scotland is not standing by as our fellow Europeans suffer. This latest substantial consignment of medical supplies helps address urgent needs identified by the Ukrainian government as it continues to resist the invasion and protect its citizens." Also today, Rural Affairs Secretary Mary Gudgeon has instructed Scottish Government officials to withdraw from any fisheries negotiations involving the Russian Federation until further notice. In a letter to the UK Government, Ms Gudgeon said talks should be postponed and said that the Scottish Government will not engage in any fisheries negotiations involving the Russian Federation. Okay, so there's 2 stories there really. So first of all, Ukraine. Scotland at government level is helping out Ukraine with medical supplies. Have you heard of any other stories of how people can help?
Yes, the Scottish Government has set up a website for Scots who might want to make donations to the Ukraine, and you should be able to see that on the screen now.
Yep, there it is. Thanks.
So please, we've been hearing news about people who've been told that they should travel to Ukraine, a bit like Miss Jean Brodie in the Spanish Civil War, but the advice is that if you want to help the situation in Ukraine, do not travel to Ukraine to pick up weapons. It would not be helping at all. Instead, maybe use this website. The advice on the website is to donate to volunteers or charities your time and your efforts, perhaps as much as anything. If you can spare cash, then you can also donate financially. And if you want to donate supplies, as in actual bandages or bedding or the like, then please don't do randomly. Please make sure that you're only going to donate items that have been asked for. So don't be sending them things that they're then going to have to deal with that they don't really want. It's maybe just also worth mentioning, you might feel a little bit underwhelmed when you read the news that the Scottish Government is going to be sending bandages to the Ukraine. I think that's probably an oversimplification. I've been reading people that are experts in the field or more knowledgeable in the field than I, that they've been looking ahead to an independent Scotland and how Scotland's strength, we would not be the kind of nation that would supply arms in a situation like this, or munitions or anything like that, but we would take a more peaceful approach and supply our medical knowledge and support. And it goes way beyond things like bandages and dressings and the like. Because of the oil industry in Scotland, I think I'm right in saying that Scotland's got an unparalleled reputation for the treatment of serious injuries like burns, that have happened on oil rigs and the like, and that is the kind of top end medical advice and support that Scotland would supply in a military situation. You also talked about the Scottish Government urging businesses not to trade with Russia. So I've done a little bit of digging there. So the obvious one that would maybe be affected by that loss of trade would be the whiskey, malt whiskey industry. Figures say that there would be about £28 million, according to the Scottish Whisky Association, that would be lost when Scotland doesn't supply Scottish whisky to the Russian market. It's a smaller Ukraine market that would be lost as well, probably. The next biggest export that came up was cashmere, and salmon is also on that list as a luxury, Scottish luxury product that would be at risk from a loss of business and trading. But it's interesting to note that Scottish salmon is actually banned in Russia already and has been since 2014. And that was what the Russians put that ban in place in retaliation against sanctions from the European Union from when Russia annexed the Crimea. So I'm not sure. There probably wouldn't be very much loss in terms of Scottish seafood that would be exported to Russia. That's an easy one already. We don't export very much there.
Yeah, but obviously whisky is big. However, the whisky trade will probably survive.
They'll survive, yeah.
Enormous.
They trade. Scotland exports less whisky to Russia than it does to America. It's a much smaller market than America. We export £245 million worth of goods and services to Russia, and I seem to have lost the equivalent figure for the USA, but it's much bigger in the USA.
Okay, but any sanctions do, of course, mean a hit for the exporter, but, well, it's a matter of priorities. We have to fight for the rights of Ukrainians to look after their own country.
Yeah, it's a much more important priority.
Now, talking of priorities, another story we've heard tonight is that the Pentagon has re-established a hotline to Russia. Remember the red telephones you used to see in old Cold War movies? The Pentagon has established a new hotline with Russia's Ministry of Defence to prevent what they call miscalculation, military incidents or escalation in the region as the Russian invasion of Ukraine advances, a US official told Reuters on Thursday. The US says it has no troops in Ukraine, but it and NATO allies in Europe are worried about potential spillover, including accidents, as Russia stages the largest assault on a European state since the Second World War. The US and its allies are also channeling millions of dollars worth of weaponry to Ukraine's armed forces, which are using the arms against Russian troops, despite warnings from Moscow against foreign interference. The US military has successfully created hotlines with Russia in the past, including during the war with Syria, where Russia intervened on the side of President Bashar al-Assad. There, the US and Russia were waging parallel military campaigns, with the US focused on battling the Islamic State. The move is just the latest effort to lower the soaring tension between the US and Russia, where President Vladimir Putin, in a clear warning to the West, announced last week that he was putting his nuclear forces on high alert. We're on a tightrope here, aren't we? Each side is wanting to make sure that they kind of contain the thing within Ukraine and it doesn't spill out. We all know what the consequences could be of spilling out. So is that how you see it then? It's this hotline, maybe the last line of defence?
I'm not quite sure what they meant by spelling out, but it's certainly the aim is clearly to lower tensions, and they really need to be lowered, because you'll probably remember that Russia recently put its nuclear forces on high alert due to the recent situation in Ukraine. And as we often say, it's like we've got to keep talking. You know, if we're going to reach any kind of sensible and peaceful conclusion, then we've got to keep talking. I tried to find out. You know, you mentioned it was a little bit like going back to the Cold War. This idea about there being a hotline between the Kremlin and the Pentagon. I did a little bit of digging. You're right. There was this, you know, Moscow-Washington hotline between the Pentagon and the Kremlin, not the White House, by the way. It is definitely Pentagon to Kremlin. So Trump, I don't know how easy it would have been for him to get access to it, but this was a Cold War communication route that was set up to allow direct communications between the leaders of Russia and the USA. It was established in 1963, the year after the Russian-Cuban missile crisis of 1962. And as far as I can tell, it's still going, it's still operational. And so that's why I'm not sure if this is a new one, or if it's running in parallel, or if it's just been rejigged in some way. But in terms of that historic post-Cuban missile hotline, it was called the Red Telephone. You often maybe see it in movies, you know, when the West Wing, and there's maybe a red
that's
telephone.
the one I saw in the White House. It was on the telly.
That's
not real.
It's not real. It's inaccurate. There was never a telephone line, and there was certainly never a red telephone. With the old Monarch style, I think, is that you see. It was called, the model was called Monarch at the time. So even in the 1960s, it was teletype that was used. And then from the 1980s, they used faxes to communicate directly between. And of course, now, more recently, it's been digital, and it's all by computers, and it's almost like a kind of email system that they've got set up. And just to put everybody's mind at rest, apparently it's tested hourly, this historic line, just in case, to make sure it's still working, where they'll just like transmit a bit of Shakespeare or a Burns poem or something, just to make sure that the connection is still active. And you mentioned that it was used in places like Syria. I think there was a similar connection set up between America and Afghanistan after 9/11. So it seems to be routine almost.
Okay, well, let's hope that rationality wins the day, because in those movies I'm talking about, the two presidents always have a last-minute conversation, and through trust and personal contacts, they
Why can't
agree
we
to
just
call it off.
get along?
Yeah, let's go and play golf. Yeah. Now, while we're talking about America, another disturbing and unpleasant story today. We've heard that the US Supreme Court has reinstated the convicted Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev's death sentence for his role in the 2013 attack, which killed 3 people and wounded more than 260 others, ruling in favour of the federal government. In a 6-3 decision, the justices sided with the Justice Department's challenge to a 2020 lower court ruling which upheld Tsarnaev's conviction but overturned the death sentence. We quote, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev committed heinous crimes. The Sixth Amendment nonetheless guaranteed him a fair trial before an impartial jury. He received one, unquote. That was Conservative Justice Clarence Thomas in his summation for the court. The court's 6 conservative justices were in the majority, with the 3 Liberals dissenting. As a candidate, Joe Biden promised to work to pass legislation in Congress to eliminate the death penalty at federal level, and also set incentives for states to do so as well, endorsing life sentences without probation or parole. However, last year his administration opted to proceed with an appeal initially launched by the Justice Department under his predecessor Donald Trump to defend Tsarnaev's death sentence. The lawyers for Tsarnaev, who is now 28 and was 19 at the time of the attack, have argued that Tsarnaev played a secondary role in the marathon bombing, with his brother Tamerlan, who they claimed was an authority figure and a violent Islamic extremist. So I suppose the issue here really is, what do we do with serious acts of deliberate murder and terrorism? Is it sufficient to offer a life sentence? And of course in Britain too there are those who would bring back the death sentence for certain crimes. So it is, but I suppose it's not surprising that the Supreme Court, 6 Conservative judges voted yes for death sentence and the 3 Liberals voted no. So that keeps rumbling in America. Some states have death sentences, some don't.
I think it's an incredibly sad story, to tell the truth. I think essentially it's a human rights story. I mean, apart from the lives that have already been lost, the bomber's brother was killed at the site of the marathon, as well as.
Well, I think he was killed in a hunt. The police hunted, I think, over a couple of days. And eventually he was cornered and shot.
Yeah, exactly. But my point is that there has already been enough loss of life in relation to this story, in my opinion, and it is about human rights in America. Capital punishment in America has been described as state-sanctioned murder, and I don't think it should be allowed. If I were President of the United States, there are two things that I would want to bring in, and one is gun control. I think there's a kind of a parallel with that, and the other is to stop capital punishment. But just a couple of figures. So capital punishment, you're right, and you have to remember there are two levels. There's state law and there's federal law. So in terms of American states and state law, capital punishment is legal in 27 American states at the moment. And it's been abolished in 23 states. So there are more states where you can find yourself on death row than not. President Trump, the previous president, he was pro capital punishment, and his administration had plans to resume executions at a federal level for federal crimes. Biden. It seems that Biden is against capital punishment. He stood on a platform before his election to oppose capital punishment at a federal level, so in direct opposition to Trump, and he would then encourage states at state law to drop capital punishment. And when you look at the figures that are in on people that are on death row, African Americans account for 41% of all the people that are on death row in America. Latino or Hispanic people come next with something like 13%, and then much further down is Asian people. And I think in America, when they say Asian, I think they really mean Oriental rather than we would mean the subcontinent of India and the like. Yeah. But it was interesting to note that there's a gender difference also when it comes to people on death row or who've even been executed in America. There have been 17 women executed in America since 1976, apparently. And I was asking you earlier on how many men you thought might have been executed in America over the same period since 1976.
What, 100?
The staggering amount of men is 1,516 people. 1,516 men have been executed in America since 1976, and only 17 women. So, yeah, it's just a huge loss of life, and I personally, I think that's why it's a human rights story as much as anything. And the fact that it seems that, tell me if I'm wrong, that Massachusetts have reinstated capital punishment to make this happen, which I think I read somewhere.
Oh, yeah, they probably... Yes, it is a democratic state, so I don't know, but that would make sense.
So it's kind of... That in itself is quite depressing.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe that just indicates, as I said before, that there are some types of crime where Conservatives have usually argued the death sentence should be brought in, for example, murder of a police officer. So, again, maybe the atmosphere surrounding a terrorist crime at that time. Everyone was frightened of terrorists, remember?
Yeah, it was post 9/11 as well, wasn't it?
Any black person with a rucksack was treated with suspicion. So it's in that atmosphere of fear and nervousness.
Well, enough time has passed, I think, now that it should allow cool heads to take control.
Okay, Brian, let's move on to just a couple of stories left tonight. Now, as it happens today, or this week anyway, marks 6 years since the Green Party... Sorry, 6 months, did I say? 6
Time
months.
Passes.
Let's edit
flies.
that out later.
Yeah.
So, Scottish Green coal leaders Patrick Harvie and Lorna Slater have marked 6 months in government with a visit to see the electric buses being produced by Alexander Dennis in Falkirk and to meet the skilled apprentices who are building them. This week marks 6 months since the cooperation deal saw the Scottish Green coal leaders take their positions as ministers, a period which has seen record investment in lowering Scotland's carbon emissions. Speaking after the visit in Falkirk, Lorna Slater said, "This week marks 6 months since we entered government, but we also saw UN climate scientists give the starkest warning yet that governments must step up their efforts to avert dangerous levels of global warming. Even though the UK government is doubling down on an agenda that will add to the climate crisis, I'm proud that with the Greens in government here in Scotland, we are implementing policies which will tackle Scotland's emissions. Now, I don't know exactly what Lorna Slater was referring to there. Do you know what? Is she maybe talking about the energy crisis and people are saying, well, we've got to increase the supply of oil and gas to make up for the any restriction from Russia?
I think that she's probably just saying that, and I think I would agree that the Greens are, Scottish Greens are a good match for the SNP. I think essentially the SNP party or the SNP government before the Greens joined them was, quite green. A lot of people would, if they weren't going to vote SNP, their second vote would maybe be for the Green Party. And so I think it's just, I think they're quite good bedfellows, and anything that makes the SNP partnership greener is a good thing in my mind.
Well, certainly under the SNP we'd already established, in fact really even under the old Labour government, the enormous growth of wind power in Scotland. That really predates the Greens' involvement in the government. So in fact, most of UK's wind energy, in fact, is from Scotland, isn't it?
Yeah,
so we're going in that direction,
and
but the Greens are giving it more of a push. Yeah,
and with the Greens in government, I think it makes it more likely for the oil to stay in the ground, which I think most people would agree that's where it should stay. It's also just been good to see the Green ministers in the cabinet standing up to answer questions in Holyrood, rather than just previously what would have just been SNP faces. It's good to see Lorna Slater and Patrick Harvey stepping up to the plate, and I think as I'm sure you've said on other Scotland at Sevens, it makes the passing of things like the budget a lot quicker, which means that money gets to people who need it sooner, which is a good thing. And of course, they'll have had a lot to be involved with in the GRA reforms, which is going through Holyrood at the moment. And also combined with the SNP, it means that Holyrood now has a pro-independence majority. So,
yes, it certainly strengthens both parties when they can say we both stood on a manifesto that there will be a referendum during a lifetime of this Parliament. So it's really not feasible it's not sensible anyway to argue that they don't have a mandate. Of course the Scottish government has a mandate.
And on the back of that, of course, I mean, more than once I've seen the First Minister literally hold out her hand to Scottish Labour and say, well, work with us. If you want to change that, then join us and we'll do it together. And that offer has never been taken up. So I don't think anybody can complain that then the party that did take up that offer or has occupied that space has been the Green Party.
Yep. Now, I'd like to go back in a way to the debate about the danger, the safety of nuclear power, because we all know we're in an energy crisis, and of course the doubling of the what is the price of oil now? Shot up to over $100 a barrel last week because of the Russian crisis. Now, there's two different responses, aren't there, north or south of the border. The south, the Conservatives are saying we need new nuclear, which as far as I know means we buy a nuclear plant from China. And of course the Scottish government will say, no, we need new investment in hydrogen and more in wind, plus the other various technologies. So there are two different directions, aren't there? So clearly under the Scottish Green SNP partnership, we're not going to be going in a nuclear direction. Incidentally, it's ironic, isn't it, that the Conservatives have been saying, and they have said this several times in Parliament recently, they've been castigating the SNP for not backing new nuclear, but they've just been saying today that the Russians bombing that plant in Ukraine just shows how dangerous nuclear is.
Yeah, Dominic Raab in his statement described the nuclear power station in Ukraine literally as a dangerous facility, and therefore it made it even more dangerous to attack it with shells. But no, you're absolutely right. I think you have to make a distinction between Scottish renewable resources and the UK's renewable resources. England, with its much larger population, may need nuclear power stations and the like, but Scotland, with its smaller population and incredibly long coastline and wind, wave and solar and and the like renewables, and I don't think we're going to need nuclear or oil. So I think we should be fine with a green SNP coalition in that sense.
Yep, and we've got to continue to move towards technologies to store power, of course. There's various ways of doing that. But we've been planning an energy special one day. We will look at that over the next couple of weeks when we can get the right guests on who might know even more than Brian does about that kind of technology. Final story tonight. Now, we hear that the party coalition governing Latvia's capital, Riga, agreed on Friday, that's today, to change the name of the street where the Russian embassy is located. It's now going to be called Independent Ukraine Street, a statement said. The move followed an announcement on Thursday that Vilnius in neighbouring Lithuania is going to change the name of the street where their Russian embassy is located to Heroes of Ukraine Street. Now, I've forgotten the name. What's the name of the street in Edinburgh which houses the Russian consulate?
That would be Melville Place.
Okay, can you think of another name for it?
Well, I mean, just going back to the news that Latvia has renamed the address for the Russian embassy. There are other precedents. I'll come on to Melville Place, but this follows recent news that in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, they had done the same thing. Just last week, I think they changed the address for the Russian consulate there. To kind of deprive it of a more prestigious address and to show up or to make it clear where Lithuania stands in relation to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. But there's an even older historic precedent. I'm sure that our viewers will remember that in 1986, Glasgow renamed St George's Place, just off George Square. They renamed it as Nelson Mandela Place because that was the address of the South African consulate in Glasgow at the time when we had apartheid in place in South Africa, and Nelson Mandela was imprisoned, I think, at that point. Michael Kelly was the Lord Provost, I think, if I'm right. So basically, Vilnius and Riga have been copying Glasgow, and I'm sure it will become something that's maybe going to happen more and more often. And we were all talking here earlier on before the show here in the studio that Melville Place, where the Russian consulate is in Edinburgh, should maybe be renamed something like Zelensky Prospect, and that might help sort of focus minds in Russia in the diplomatic corps.
Yeah, I do remember Nelson Mandela himself, when he came to Glasgow after his release, he did say that he was aware that the letters addressed to the consulate, South African consulate in Glasgow, had to be addressed to Nelson Mandela Square. So that was encouraging. He knew that.
It's one of those things where I think I would love to have been in the office when somebody came up with that idea. I just would have loved to have been there. So, yeah.
So let's. I think this now falls down to our readers in Edinburgh. So why don't you contact the council leader in Edinburgh, suggest a name change to, let's call it, what do you say, Zelensky Prospect? Yeah.
Zelensky Prospect.
So yeah, come on, Edinburgh. Let's see what we can do about that. I saw somebody the other day sticking up a blue plaque outside Roman Abramovich's flat in villa in London.
Yes. Yes, and if you go back to the lockdowns here in Glasgow, the street names in Glasgow were secretly named overnight away from the names of families that had profited from the trade with tobacco and cotton and the like, and so there's Glasgow has precedence. And just by the way, for viewers, Prospect apparently is a kind of an Eastern European name for a boulevard or a plaza.
So that means Zelensky.
So Zelensky
Avenue, really.
Boulevard.
Yes, okay, well, I wonder if anyone in the Edinburgh City Council is considering that name change. Right, well, that's about it from me and Brian tonight. I'm just going to remind you all that we are free to view. We don't receive any public funding. And the only reason we're here is because of you watching, and in particular the people who are our supporters. Now, you can become one of our supporters by simply looking at the website here, and you can click on the link. And if you can send 5, 10, 20, no upper limit a month, then that'll keep the lights on here in the studio. And we have plans to expand the range of programmes, and we've got all the equipment too. It's all ready here, but the more funding we get, the more programmes we'll make. So that's very important. We have discussed several times tonight, Brian, how important it is to get news. It's our aim to be an impartial, a fair broadcaster for Scotland. We're not influenced by London politics. We look at things from Scotland's point of view. But as you said earlier on before, Brian, we actually do support the BBC in their work in Russia, and we just don't think they're in a position to do the same job for Scotland. We need independent broadcasting for Scotland. So give us a hand and we'll keep putting the news out and even more of it. So thanks for watching tonight. We're back on Sunday lunchtime with the full Scottish, and that's all from me, Hugh Stewart, and Brian Liddy, and we'll see you later. Thanks for watching. Bye. Okay, that's us out then, Brian. Thanks.